Thank you so much for being here. This is such a wonderful crowd. I'm very honored to be holding this space for you and with you. All of us in this room, on some level, we are here together because we have an interest in telling our real personal stories that have included adversity, trauma, and very vulnerable material. And we want to know how to do them well. And so I thank you for allowing me to speak to you on this really meaningful topic. My name is Reema Zaman. You may know me from something I've written or from a podcast appearance or a speaking engagement, or there's a lot of really nice momentum and buzz around my forthcoming memoir. It's called I Am Yours. But what you may not know is that prior to trying my hand at writing, I was an actress. And I studied that since I was 15 years old. I went to college for that, and that's my training. And so that's what I bring to writing. And the first thing we're taught as actors is that the audience and artist relationship is a sacred one. And respect begets respect, love begets love, and vulnerability begets vulnerability. So it's through that sacred communion and the honor of that sacred communion through which I do my work. When I sat down to write my memoir in 2013, November, and I knew that my story would hold a great deal of vulnerable material, wading through childhood trauma, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and it became it felt like a responsibility on my behalf that I would have to figure out how to not only process for myself, but bring to the page this material in a way that would be meaningful and useful to others, and in a way that wouldn't re-trigger myself or any listening or reading party. And the first thing I realized is that what I had learned as an actress really came into benefit, that this is a sacred relationship, and there are 5 main pillars to telling stories of radical vulnerability. I believe the first pillar is purpose. Finding a deep-rooted purpose behind telling our personal narrative. Now, I think our creative and personal purpose, professional purpose, is deeply aligned with the life purpose we each feel we were born to serve. I'm lucky that I came into my life purpose at a rather young age. I'm from Bangladesh. I was born there. And when I was 11 years old, a cousin, 20 years my senior, tried to molest me. And I'm thankful that I was able to escape, largely due to the fact that other members of my family had warned me of the things he had done to them. So I took my story as well as theirs, and I reported all the incidents. And in response, I was told boys will be boys, and that this happens especially between cousins. And in that moment, a few things occurred. One, I learned that the reason why the culture of abusers and predators exist and will continue to exist is because there is a partner culture of complicity that is built on the silencing of the stories and voices of girls. And the other thing that happened in that moment was I made a vow. I told myself that if the people around me were unable or unwilling to speak, then I would devote my life to being a voice for the stories and souls silenced. Which is why I became an artist, and I believe all of us, on some level, we have a similar story where something happened, perhaps it was in our childhood or our teens or our young adult years, and we clued into the fact that we had to use something to be of use to others. That something about our personal narrative spoke to a universal narrative. And by telling our stories, we would be bringing solidarity, empathy, awareness, and hopefully healing to others. And so having this sense of purpose, I have realized that it's allowed me to withstand and overcome nearly any personal obstacle. And with the inevitable rejections that come from the querying process in our professional lives, the submission process with publishers and editors, I have found that having a deep-rooted sense of mission driving your work is the thing that it helps soften the frustrations of our daily lives, our personal lives, and our professional lives. Because when you know that you are working from a place of service as opposed to just a personal drive, you know that no matter what is thrown in your way, you're going to keep going. And I feel that's how our chapters arrive as well. Even at the, when we're procrastinating or feeling doubt or worry about the overall objective of our work, having this deep-rooted sense of mission keeps us with our pen on the page or our hands on the computer, however you type or write. So I implore you to find a spine for your narrative, because it is the thing that will drive the objective of the story, and it will act as the spine of your writing life. And ultimately, I mean, we might as well, talk about this, which is all of us on some level, we want to make bestseller lists, and we want people to buy our books or read our essays and make them go viral. And the thing is, though, we can't control any of that. And to attempt control would be ego. And ego is the surefire strategy for creative failure. And I have found that actually refocusing our energy on doing acts of service, doing writing that is of service, it invariably allows to doing writing that is of use to someone else. And ultimately, it is usefulness that creates authentic demand. Even to know that your story has use in someone else's life, even one person, you're a success just by virtue of that. Okay. The second pillar, which brings me to, speaking of blocks, forgiveness. I think this is a really huge facet to doing work of radical vulnerability, and to do it with a sense of clarity and determination on our part. So when I sat down to write my memoir, because I'm a very good student and an overachiever, I made a meticulous outline of all the characters and the chapter points and the narrative threads, and I felt so proud of myself. And I went out through my outline, checking them all off, and everything was going merrily until I came across to the point where I was writing about myself as an 18-year-old. And when I was 18 years old, a teacher in my high school started preying upon me. He figured out my classroom schedule, which is meant to remain confidential, meaning he had an accomplice in the administration. He found my classroom schedule, and he started calling me on various classroom phones. And he also started writing me these long, elaborate letters, handwritten, entirely in red ink. And I remember his handwriting was so labored. He had spent so much time on these letters that the handwriting looked like font. Anything to exert his authority and his imprint into my life, he made sure to do. And in all of those letters and all of the phone calls, he would repeat the same sexual innuendo. He would tell me that I was a naughty girl, that I had misbehaved, that how dare I didn't listen to him, and that I deserved to be put in my place. So, though he never physically touched me, I am willing to bet all of that was sexual. The hunting, the tracking, the preying, like an animal. So I reported all of these incidents. I took the actual physical evidence and I took it to my principal, and he confiscated everything. And I told my parents, and because of our Bangladeshi culture, in our culture, we're taught not to speak up against authority, and teachers are seen as authority figures and very respected in our community, so they too stayed silent. And so as my 30-year-old author self, writing about my 18-year-old inner child, that girl who was terrified, who had been neglected, who had her security and safety and her dignity ignored by everyone around her, as an adult self, I filled with this protective fury and sorrow and grief, so much so that I found myself incapable of finishing that chapter, let alone going into the next one. In short, I found myself immobilized with fury and grief because the narrative threads and characters in my life had chosen not to behave the way I wish they had. And that's when it occurred to me what forgiveness really requires of us. Forgiveness asks that we let the fairy tale of what could have been and should have been, we let it all die. Forgiveness asks that we release the notion that we can go back in time and change any of the narrative. And the wonderful thing is that forgiveness isn't actually forgetting, nor is it weakness. Ultimately, it is self-authored freedom. Forgiveness allows us to release the narrative so that we can write of the narrative. It allows us to take that step back so we can become the observer and author of our story, in addition to being the protagonist of our story. And once I made that distinction, I was able to look at my story as if it was in my own hands and look it around and mine the wisdom from those wounds. I was allowed to look at how my personal narrative connected to a larger conversation about silenced stories, silenced voices, neglect, the systemic culture of abuse and complicity. In short, I was able to start doing my job and at the same time begin my healing process. Which brings us to the third pillar. Speak from the scar, not the wound. So with this sentence, for me, what it really means is to look at the difference between righteous pain and sacred pain. So all of us are in this room because we believe there is great benefit to sharing our painful narratives. Because if we share them in a well-fashioned way, that pain becomes almost sacred. It reminds us that we are more alike than we are different, that in our pain we are actually touching upon something deep and sacred of our humanity. It alleviates the loneliness of being human and alive in this world. And I believe that's sacred pain, when we are able to let our wounds scar over and we speak from that place of groundedness and healthy emotional detachment. We speak from a place of perspective because healthy perspective creates healthy scar tissue. As opposed to righteous pain, which we've all been exposed to in some level, whether it's in our personal lives. We all know that one person who is so adamant at holding on to their pain that they use their pain as an excuse to be painful and wounding towards others. It's a righteous sensibility that my pain is somehow superior to yours, and I will hold on to it and use it as my excuse to wound everyone else. That's righteous pain. And that's when we are speaking from the deep, raw, hot glare of the raw wound, as opposed to the scar. And again, when it comes to the artist and author relationship, that sacred relationship, I believe we do our audience a disservice if we haven't taken the personal time to allow our wounds to scar over, so that when we are in front of an audience, whether it's the physical audience or on the page, we are giving them something that has been well-fashioned in the name of this sacred communion. And the wonderful thing is that our first drafts, I believe, are just purely for our own selves. It's for our own healing. And the amazing thing about a first draft is we can pour every single detail of the righteous anger and the rightful righteous anger of the things that have happened towards us, the sorrow, the grief, and then the consequent second and final draft, second, third, fourth, 14th final drafts. Yeah, I'm like second to fourth. Yeah, let's be real here. So all of the consequent drafts are curated from that first draft. After we take a step back, we allow our wounds to scar over, and we look at our narrative in the way it connects to the larger human canon. And I think that's where we do our curation, we do our editing. That's when I feel like the first draft is like an oil painting of layering things, and then the second, third, fourth, 14th, 46th drafts it's like carving, it's sculpting. And to speak from the scar allows us to do that sculpting process with a great deal of clarity and focus and a sense of calm. Because the last thing we want is to be sitting at our desks, continually re-triggering ourselves and re-traumatizing ourselves. Because I believe we are our best litmus test. If we're re-traumatizing ourselves, chances are we're going to do that with our audience as well. And if our larger mission is service, well, it just means we need to sit at the desk for a little bit longer until the work is ready. Someone who does this beautifully is, I believe, Cheryl Strayed. She has such an authority, over, especially in Wild, and I have it here. And I was thinking about reading a passage, but I think we're all pretty much, aware of her work. And she has the entire book is about her coming to terms with forgiveness that her mother was taken away in such a brutal and quick fashion from her. And how do you survive that? I mean, it's just the most brutal wound. And you see her voice come to that forgiveness, that path of forgiveness, and that path of speaking from the scar and not the wound. And she narrates that journey for us so beautifully that we too can take her wisdom and apply it to our own lives. And it's because she's speaking with the sense of authority. She has gained the emotional authority over the narrative thread of her life, so that we in turn can receive that enlightenment and those tools as well. Now, pain into poetry. So this, if purpose drives objective, I believe poetry creates trust. And what I mean by poetry is we each have a specific writing voice and a sense of nuance and style that we each do very well. And most of the time it's influenced by our natural personality. I think the audience's attention, I can always tell when someone's pushing for my attention, when they're trying to just pull it out like teeth, and there's nothing more uncomfortable than that. We want to immediately recoil the moment we smell desperation on someone, whether it's on stage, on camera, or on the page. And it comes from a very authentic place that we can all have compassion for. We each want attention and to feel loved and special. But the way to create authentic loyalty and love from the audience is to do it in the same way that we would do it in any relationship. It has to be earned. And I think authentic loyalty, attention, and love from an audience or a reader is through showing them the respect that you have for them, and to demonstrate that you have gained an authority over your narrative. In short, that you have turned your pain into poetry. You have taken the time to come to them from a place of confidence. There's few things are more uncomfortable than going through someone's vulnerable story and feeling vulnerable in their hands. I think that's a real key element for us to remember. We want to invite people into our painful narratives, but never at the cost of putting pain on top of them. It's like to move through uncomfortable situations without ever really feeling uncomfortable. And that's the fine balance that we skirt when it comes to trauma writing, when it comes to memoir. And I believe this comes from gaining a fluency over our unique poetry. So your poetry, your voice, may be comedy, wit, charm. Elizabeth Gilbert is an amazing, charming voice. I can't do charm to save my life. It comes off as desperation because it's not an authentic part of me. Wit, Mary Carr, she does wit masterfully. But then again, those of us who aren't naturally witty or comedic, that becomes uncomfortable for our audience. It becomes uncomfortable for us because it requires a laborious effort that isn't the authentic effort that goes into craft. If I may, I'd like to read something from my memoir, and it's this is my fluency. He snores. Unconsciously, he throws an arm over me. By habit, my fingers engage in a nightly ritual to search his skin and along his hairline for telltale hard knots where deer ticks may have bitten into him. Deer ticks can lead to Lyme disease. I've lost count how many I've found and pinched off during our years together. He turns his head, and from under his pillow comes a crackle of plastic, an empty condom wrapper. Bizarre. A year and a half into our marriage, and I still insist on him using a condom. More bizarrely, he amiably complies without argument. One by one, telltale knots of a disease requiring diagnosis are coming into view. Occasionally, he calls me his wife for greensies, not for realsies, to remind me that my green card was procured through marriage, to remind me that I am dependent on him, to remind me that in his eyes, I, his Bangladeshi immigrant wife, to his American privilege, have no power, to remind me that I can be disowned so casually, even deported so easily, that his love can be withdrawn so nonchalantly. How peaceful he looks when he sleeps. I imagine we all look this way when the face finally stills, the day's worries subside, and the chaos we carry calls a truce for these stolen hours of rest. The raging mind and heart decide, for these hours we won't battle. Sometimes I wish he would physically hit me. Then I could point to a bruise as a receipt, proof of grief, permission to leave. The catch with emotional warfare is it's inflicted with far more stealth and elegance than abuse delivered by touch, making it easier to accept, rationalize, ignore, forgive, page after page. I am cognizant that I am held under him by a noose woven partly by my complicit hands. So because I knew that asking anyone to hold that space with me through brutal situations is asking a lot of a human being, I trained myself to figure out some kind of lyricism for my work. And I guess that is the language that I use for my voice, for my fluency. Figuring out your poetry will act as the softening agent for your audience to sit in that hot red glare of that pain. Finding lyricism, finding wit, finding humanity and comedy, it allows us to be with each other as we go through this journey. Furthermore, I try very hard to infuse all of my writing with a sense of resilience so that unconsciously or consciously, my audience feels that even if we're going through choppy waters, I have demonstrated the confidence that we will get through this. I can captain this ship for us. And I think that's what, in the end, our readers are looking to us for. That even if we've gone through these brutal situations, we will make it over to the other side. So I ask you to find the poetry of your specific voice, gain fluency in that poetry, because fluency allows for authority, and authority creates trust. It is the only authentic way we can gain and keep the loyalty of our readers. Finally, transformation. Again, we can't, at the end of the day, decide whether or not someone's going to pick up our book and fall in love with it, or ask every single one of their friends and colleagues and family members to buy the book. And ultimately, to try to control any of that is ego. And ego is a surefire strategy to creating work that fails to land. I believe really the thing that drives authentic connection and sales and demand is work of transformation. And to trust that if we work on creating something that authentically transforms us, by virtue of being human, our work, whether it's an essay, a memoir, a book, by virtue of being human, it will have an identical or at least similar effect on other humans. So that's what I ask, is let's just try to work on the transformation that we are trying to gain in our own lives. I know for myself, one of the reasons I sat down to write my memoir was because, due to my history with sexual assault and sexual violence, it had all metastasized in a perilous relationship with anorexia. I battled anorexia for about 15 years, from age 15 to age 30, and I had tried everything to let that disease go. And writing a memoir was my last-ditch effort. I thought, you know what? Since things started breaking down as a child, what if I came up with a way to go back in time? And again, I can't change the narrative, I can't change the experiences, but I can hold space for my inner child in a way that the adults in my life were unable to. And in a way, isn't that what all memoir is? On some level, we are reparenting ourselves. We are going back in time and we are holding space for our inner child or our young adult self, and we're giving our younger self the time and space and healing and support and unconditional love that the people in our lives at that moment didn't really know how to give us. So that's what I did. Every day, I started my memoir in the very beginning of infancy, and I just went through every single significant experience that had happened in my life that had caused my disruption and the disruption, the erosion of self. And I just sat with my inner child as she went through these different experiences. And I gave her the unconditional love that I wish I had received when it had actually happened. And lo and behold, about into the 6-month point of writing my memoir, I started feeling a visceral change in my lived self. I started acting in ways that I had never acted before. For instance, I stopped denying myself food. I stopped being attracted to abusive relationships. I stopped going towards traumatic situations or situations and people that would put my body, or at least my mind and my spirit, in danger. In short, I started behaving as though I had been raised with love. And not to say that my parents didn't, but we all give the love that we are capable of. I ended up writing a memoir that transformed me about 180 degrees. The inkling to ever hurt myself or starve myself, it has gone from being normal to illogical. And that's the best job I can do with my work, which is thinking, if it did that for me, hopefully it'll hold that for others. And it kind of takes the pressure away when I'm thinking about, book launches and Amazon and everything, because if I've been able to transform myself, that in and of itself makes me a success, because I get to live now. And I think that's what all of us want. We just want to know that our work is triumphant for ourselves and hopefully for others too, by virtue of all being human. And I think that's what we're all here for, to alleviate the despair and loneliness that can arise from being human. We're here to give each other space and hold each other's space in this really noble work of nonfiction and memoir writing. So to close, I'd like to finish with a little, I do these love letters every Monday that I post on Facebook and Instagram, and it epitomizes what I really believe is radical vulnerability and what I've covered here today. Dear love, I was 11 when the first predator arrived. I was 15 when I contracted anorexia. I say contracted because I feel anorexia is a viral illness, a side effect of being a girl in this world. I was 18 when the second predator arrived. I was 18 when I immigrated to the United States by myself. I was 21 when I had my first miscarriage. 23 brought rape. 24 brought assault of another kind. By 26, I was married, and by 27, divorced. Rejection, like any experience, is anything we make of it. I started acting and modeling when I was 15 and writing at age 30. I've had over 3,000 auditions, and of the 3,000, I've booked 27 jobs. As a writer, I've been rejected over 200 times by agents, publishers, and editors. Today, I am 34. My memoir is available for pre-order, and my idols are now my colleagues. Leverage every adversity towards your advantage. Mine every wound for wisdom. Decide that each experience will be used towards your empowerment, not disempowerment. Rejection is but a cosmic hand guiding us away from the path that isn't ours towards the path that is. And ultimately, the loyalty that truly matters is our own. Fight to heal, heal to rise. focus on the sole number that ultimately matters. 1. Only you author your one precious life. Never let anyone ghostwrite your narrative. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I don't even know how long that was. Oh, okay. Any questions at all? Yes.
It is very hard, especially when people come, because I teach writing classes, when people come in, they want to go to that deepest, darkest thing.
Right.
But we don't always have the skill level to do justice to the pain. And I always tell people that famously, what Barbara Kingsolver has said, the Poisonwood Bible was her 4th novel. She had to write 3 before she felt she had the toolbox to be able to do that. And yet you've just sort of identified that that wasn't the case with you. And I've read your work. In fact, HippoCamp magazine was the first place I read The Harvest of Bodies, and I was teaching a class in Memoir, and I shared it with my students, and I said, you have to read this because you were mining not only your own pain, but you were looking at the objectification of women, the commodification of their bodies. How did you come to that level of sophistication as a complete beginning writer? How did you not fall prey to the over-dramatization, or because we want so desperately to be understood that we sometimes kill our stories in the telling with too much.
Right. Well, thank you. It's really kind. I think it's because of my acting background, and a screenplay, there is no exposition. Everything lives in the action and the dialogue and the immediacy and urgency of the text and of the words. And so it's all about stripping back to get to the very, very clean, lean narrative of what are these two people trying to tell each other. And so I think it's from that, understanding that sometimes instead of making 5 gestures or using your entire face to emote sadness, it's actually much more real and human if you just get quiet. Sometimes that's what heartbreak is. Heartbreak isn't a lavish dance on the floor of improvised grief. It's just a deadened face. And so I think I apply that to my writing as well. I try to find the leanest and cleanest, most precise way to tell the story, and to trust that, because I think that the thing that drives me most is I take it for granted we all know what we're talking about. Like, you understand my pain, and I understand yours, and I think I find comfort in that. I choose to believe in that because that's the thing that keeps me waking up every morning, that you understand me and I understand you. So, and it also helps me from gesturing my work, over-gesturing and over-dramatizing my work. Because that's a term we use in acting. Just embody, don't gesture. So it's like, instead of going from the show, don't tell, and I've said this to you before, I was like, it's not even about tell or show, it's about feel. If I can feel it, I trust that you will as well. And at the end of the day, the over-dramatizing comes from insecurity. So again, use the first draft to heal the deficit, the woundedness that we all have, to gain authority in your writing voice so that you don't have to gesture in the consequent drafts. That makes sense? Okay. Yes?
Kind of following up on her question, but I also like what you said about to write from your scar, not your wound, or whatever. So there was like a timing thing. Like, how did you know, like, when your wound had been scarred? I mean, was it really clear to you?
Right. I stopped getting nightmares. The first 6 months of writing my memoirs, every single night. And I just held space for myself with that. I said, you know what? That's me going through the story. And that's going to be necessary. Because I think in the madcap pace of living life, I hadn't even allowed myself to feel so many of the experiences because the urgency with which we run just to make it to the next day. And so I gave myself that permission to go through the nightmares. And there was almost a radical, day and night change. On one day, I stopped having nightmares. And I realized, oh, okay, now I know my story. I'm not feeling it anymore in a good way. So I think the body is very, very intelligent. If we allow it to listen, if we allow it to speak to us, it will. So sometimes I've had a lot of students who have had rashes for the first couple of months of writing, and then the rashes go away. Or they're breaking out into hives over here, because this is where our voice is, the voice chakra, heart chakra, all of it over here, all the things we've repressed for years. And then finally, when we give voice to ourselves, it's like red patches here. I've had a lot of students with that. Your body will tell you. And I think, just listen, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. That was beautifully put, everything.
Thank you.
When you first opened, you talked about the predators and also the complicit. I think you said, did you say a culture of complicity?
Yeah, a culture of complicity. I think that's how, it's kind of like chicken and egg.
Right.
What came first, the wounded child, the violated child, or the culture that enables it?
Right. So I asked myself at that moment when you said that about my own complicity. Like, in my story, like, did that ever come up for you? Do you know what I mean?
Right, yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, because that is, I do a whole workshop that's just on forgiveness, and another part of forgiveness is not only forgiving the characters in our lives who have been complicit in our pain, but also ourselves, when we know we have spoken in a way that has betrayed ourselves, or acted in a way, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
Totally.
when we've been complicit in our own betrayal or abandonment, because that is the ultimate betrayal, is when we abandon ourselves. And I think that's, again, to find forgiveness for that.
Right.
Of,
I totally recognize that you don't want to put words in somebody else, but I'll just say, like, and I don't want to do the same to you, but just say we're in a specific type of relationship that has an abusive dynamic, but we have complicity in that relationship.
Right.
Right. So that's the question is around that topic. Like, how do we look at our own complicity? And you're saying it's part of the forgiveness process.
It's part of the forgiveness, I think, to be really transparent, not just honest, but accountable. Like, what were the things that drove us to behave in that manner, and what are the takeaways and the drastic adjustments that are necessary to be made, kind of thing. I think forgiveness really comes from this radical accountability, but at the same time a radical self-compassion, to know that often the reasons why we bruise other people is because, not to use it as an excuse, but it was taught to us. Racism is taught to us, prejudice is taught to us, sexism, misogyny is taught to us. But then once we've recognized that and accepted that, it's on us to do the work to evolve.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question, Yes.
Thank you. I'm really glad I stepped into this room, and I'll take
Oh,
a lot from it.
Thank you.
When did you hit roadblocks where the writing where it felt like you weren't, how did you decide you were ready to write? Was that linear?
Right.
What happened if you hit a roadblock, and how did you keep from confusing that with feeling like you can't write? Or like getting...
Oh, totally. It's a great question. So when I sat down to write, it was November 28, 2013, and I made this vow I was going to write this book, and I had never written or published anything, not a personal essay. And when my agents told me to write a personal essay so that it would help with my career, I literally had to Google what is a personal essay, and she sent me a list of, it was like a BuzzFeed list of top 20 places you want to get published at. I was like, okay, Salon, what is that? Slate, what is that? Guernica, and so I had no experience whatsoever, and in a way that worked in my benefit. I call it the utility of futility. I had no writer friends. I didn't even know there was a thing such as writers groups. And I think that because of that, I kind of went in with this wild audacity and this sense of there were no stakes as well as every stake. And it was freeing. Nobody ever cared to read my work. Nobody had any expectation. And I allowed myself to draw strength from that. It released me from a preconceived notion of what my work had to be like, a preconceived audience. And at the same time, I also put some healthy pressures on myself, which I said, this is my last chance at healing the cycle of abuse that I've been in. So I gave myself the pressure that was rooted in service and not ego. You know, it wasn't the pressure of, oh, I have to sell 1,000 million copies of this and impress everyone. That would just make for bland writing, I think. I gave myself the pressure that I had to heal my life so that I can survive. And in the end, that worked out. And, you know, during the days of, because it is so painful to write our stories again. And so how do you move through that? I actually started tapping into my inner child and just watching her be so resilient through the odds. She had so many things placed upon her with nobody else around her. And so on the days when I felt so emotionally exhausted, I felt like I couldn't write, I would write in the name of her. Because if she was able to keep going and remain alive, surely I can keep writing about her. Yeah, thank you. I think you wouldn't be in this room unless you had enormous reserves of resilience. I mean, that will, I mean, what's writer's block to that? You know? Yeah.
So Reema, I'm wondering, you went from embodying others' voices as an actress to finding your own.
Right.
And you obviously had a really significant journey in doing that, but I'm curious what you teach your students in terms of finding their own voice, because yours is so specific that how do you teach others to hone their voices and make them so unique to them?
Right. Thank you. That's a fantastic question. You know, in acting, we always say that every single story has been told already. And in writing, we say this as well. There's a gazillion different people trying to book the same job. And I think, and then the same lessons can be applied for writing, except because acting is a physicalized art, you can see it more clearly what we mean by that. There's going to be hundreds of women standing outside vying for the same role. And you can allow that to make you crazy and go into competition with them, or just realize, well, you know, the only way to gain any kind of success and longevity in this is to continually strip everything back and focus on the pure, authentic voice. And so that's what you're asking about. It's like, how do we get to that place? You know, it's tempting, you know, when you pick up a book by somebody you love, and imitation is the greatest form of flattery and admiration, it's tempting to do that. And sometimes maybe that's like the gateway into your own voice, where you realize, oh yeah, I love it how Lydia Yuknovich is just so great with her rage, and she plays with her rage like it's a ball of fire. And then you I tried to do that, and I was like, wow, but it's not me. But it did allow me to find permission for my rage in my own way. And so I think that's like, go lean into the voices that do strike something in you, because that's real. Trust that real urge, that like butterflies that you feel for every, you know, a writer here or there, because that is cluing you into a deep sensibility about your own voice. But use them as a portal instead of a blueprint. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so
Sorry.
much for the great speech.
Oh, you're welcome.
There are
Thank you.
pieces of our memoir that when we write and edit for the 46th time, we still get triggered by sadness. When
I
we
know.
read. Does that mean that it's not ready yet?
Or maybe it's just fantastic. Maybe you're just so good at it. I mean, litmus tests. We are our best litmus tests. My my rule of thumb for myself was when I was writing about my ex-husband, and you have to create stakes for your audience, meaning you have to go back in time and do the situations where when you met him and fell in love with him. My litmus test was I have to write it in a way where I fall in love with this man all over again, even though I know 7 years later he is an abuser. And so yes, I fell in love, I cried, and that's a good thing, So sometimes it's just a measure of you doing your damn good job, like you're doing it really well. Of course, there is a difference between feeling sorrow and being moved to tears and being distraught. And if you feel like you're going back into despair, then maybe it is a moment to take pause and see if that's speaking on maybe something else going on in your present day life, right? I think all writing is so spiritual, and it's trying to speak to us, whether it's our inner voice speaking through us or trying to speak to us in return about something that's happening in our present life, but we think it's about our past and we're like, nah, it's happening right now too. It's all of that. Listen to the words. Thank you. Yes.
This may sound similar, but regarding the steps,
Yes.
are they all necessary?
No, not at all.
My issue is a medical thing.
Okay.
And,
Yeah.
I'm looking through this and I'm like, okay, the forgiveness part I'm having problems with.
Right.
Like really nothing to forgive there.
Right.
So I'm just like,
Totally.
the steps, I guess, relate to your situation.
Yeah, of course, and that's why I call them pillars or elements versus. I also don't. I don't empathize, or I don't agree with steps too, because in my life, because as a recovering anorexic, anything that has to do with numbers is bad for me. So I try not to numericalize things, and say like, oh, we have to do number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because then that's my drowning. Yeah, and so same. It's like they're elements, and at different points in our lives, the elements will hold different gravitas, each one. And with different narrative threads, sometimes we don't even have to go through a certain one of the pillars. Although I know for me, the times where I have, and again, I'm just speaking from my own experience with illness, I have had to do some of forgiveness just through the rage I have felt against life putting me through something. With being raped when I was 23, I didn't have any shame about myself. I didn't hold any of that, thankfully. But the thing I did have to forgive was life. Because I realized if I held this against life, it would actually cut me off from having a full life. So I think in that way, you can massage what forgiveness means when it comes to events or illnesses or characters, brutalities in any form. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's my perspective.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I would like to speak to this lady's question,
Yes.
if I may. Your question. I'm going to refute a little bit
Yeah.
what you said. I've had work that has done well.
Yeah.
But I found that I have been able simultaneously to hone my craft in this work.
Yeah.
But I did go back to something terrible that happened when I was 11 years old, and I was re-traumatized as I was working it, as I was honing my craft as an adult and a writer, and so it was really interesting to feel both of those things.
Yes.
But I certainly did not feel, when I got that draft that was published, that I was absolutely fine. There was a lot. I had the craft, and I was working on the puzzles that a writer works on.
Right.
But that was still there. I did feel that it lifted after I had finished that some of that had lifted. But yes.
It's an ongoing
Yes,
journey.
it is.
I mean, healing, like living, is ongoing. It's like we
Yes.
just have to make it through one at a time. Yeah. And thank you for saying that, because it's a very real part of the conversation. And again, it's like in the same way that there's no 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
We're done. And now we are totally enlightened beings. I am good. I'll be the last person to say that. Yeah. So thank you. Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice for getting deeper? Like, I feel like when I write about my experiences, I go to humor. And I don't know if that's my way of avoiding it and not getting deeper, but like I hear people talk about their stories and they're crying, and I'm like, why am I not crying? Like,
I'm not a crier
I don't
either.
know. Like, I don't know if I am or not. Like, I am a little bit, but I just feel like I don't go deep enough. Like, I don't remember exactly how I felt during like the things that happened.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice to getting deeper?
Yeah. Sometimes just stripping away all exposition and just doing dialogue for a while, even if you're not going to keep it for a final draft. There's something about being healthily forced into just saying the words you would say, as opposed to explaining or the beautiful, the beautiful decor or the situation. Situation and humor really allows us to step away from the hot glare of the pain, and sometimes just going to human language.
Yeah.
If you just maybe try that exercise of just speaking it for a while, allowing it to come through your characters, just the way they would say it. We say so much in our words and in the silences. Strip it back. Yeah. Yes.
I'm not sure which one.
Okay, go on. Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate the pillars that you shared with us. That's just such an incredibly layered and helpful explanation.
Thank
I
you.
was interested in knowing a little bit more about your perspective of the vulnerable narrator who has agency.
Yes.
And also, maybe has experienced victimization, but also demonstrates resilience.
Yeah.
What are some qualities, I guess, of resilience that you see in a narrator who is vulnerable, but also is an agent of resilience?
Right. Well, I think true vulnerability is courage. And I think that's why people love reading memoirs, is readers realize that it is in our most vulnerable state that we are actually our most resilient and courageous selves. And so I think those are not, they're simultaneous and, if anything, synonymous. Vulnerability is courage. And authentic resilience, I think, comes from just refusing to allow the adversities to be our disempowerment, right? So are you asking how to create a resilient voice, or
curious
just
about the characteristics that you perceive. I actually really appreciate your response.
Oh, okay.
That's really helpful.
Oh, wait, thank you.
Thank you.
I just, I think, resilience just comes through, I think strength can come through practice, but resilience is a muscle, and the more we use it, the stronger it grows. Yeah, thank you.
Did you have any repressed memories that you still have repressed?
I know that that's a great question. I understand what you mean, yeah.
In the sense that, the body keeps the score, so
Right.
you know that there's things in there that happened, but that you also don't have access to or don't know? Is that part of your experience? If
Yeah.
so, how did you deal with that?
How did I deal with that?
And if not, then just...
I think, in a way, I just kind of lived in a repressed state for a long time. And I think that was part of my anorexia. And also, I had a perilous ability to get myself into dangerous relationships, romantic and sexual relationships. So I think that was my repression, in a way. It wasn't in the way we think it's like, it wasn't a zombie state, but it was a zombie state.
So what I mean is that with the traumatic events that you experienced,
Yeah.
Do you feel like you have full access to those experiences, or do you feel like there are parts of those experiences that you still don't know what happened?
I don't know if I would know, I guess, if there were still...
So if there's like blankouts or like...
Oh, no, I don't have any of those.
There's
or
no gaps in your story.
There's no gaps, no.
Okay.
No. There were missing, or there were diluted details that I had come up with a story I had come up with a reaction to those details so that I could survive.
Sure.
I had played down my parents' complicity and the pain of that, and I didn't really access that, the truth of that, and therefore the anger until I was 30 years old, where suddenly I was like, I'm so angry, and because I was just, Asian woman trained to be very polite and happy and courteous and pleasant. And it wasn't until I was 30 years old where I tapped into this thing called rage. And I was like, oh my God, what is this? Yeah. If that makes sense at all, there were different points of coming into awareness. And I think repression, anyone who's worked in mental health before, it's kind of the brain's way of, it's like a survival mechanism, so that you can go through the trauma, and then when you're in a physically safer place, to then process things or begin processing things.
Can I
Yeah.
address that?
Sure.
Because I have a lot of blank spots, and there's a lot of stuff I remember, and the way I've addressed it is I'm upfront about what I remember, and some of that is bad enough that if the stuff I can't remember is worse, I assume it's worse, otherwise I would be able to remember, so I don't care, I don't wanna know.
Right.
It's really like, I'll put it out there, like, I don't remember these 3 months or whatever, but this is what
And
I
it's
do
for,
remember.
yeah.
So I don't need to remember that, I just know it was bad enough that I had to protect myself and move on.
Totally.
But I do, address that this is, I don't have those months, they're gone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, when you're in these abusive relationships, was there a part of your feeling that you had to forgive yourself? Like, did you blame yourself for getting involved? And was that part of it?
Yeah.
You had to, actually, I forgive myself for getting myself in these situations.
Definitely. And I think, especially as women, we're so hard on ourselves, but that's also a lot of the gaslighting that comes from just growing up in patriarchy, which is we're always at cause or culpable in our abuse. And so I had to start differentiating the authentic complicity and then guilt that wasn't mine to feel, and shame that was not mine to feel, and it was just indoctrinated through gaslighting, telling me that you are bad for getting yourself in this situation, you are to blame, you should second guess what you know to be right and true.
How did you do that, just going back?
And I make a lot of, I'm driven by precision, because I think precision allows for clarity allows for release and peace. So yeah, I wrote a lot, and to find the framework of everything. My background, I was a women's studies major, so persuasive essays, sometimes that's how I gain entry into an emotional scene, is to write it, just break it down, unpack it for the politics and the personal, and see that, well, they are one and the same, and find my place in that. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does.
It does, yeah. And I know that just one thing. For, I think, so many memoirs, we have the fear that will come off as self-indulgent, or to talk when we're talking about the things we have gone through. And then we're so quickly to, put the blame on ourselves. And I really think we have to just also take into consideration the gaslighting that as so many of us have been exposed to, and that it's okay to allow abusers to hold the main responsibility. And then be, of course, honest and accountable when it is our rightful place for that. Thank you. Yes.
I just wanted to mention the word therapy. That, I hear this and I know that it's all related to writing, but part of my memoir is an adult lifetime of therapy, and I think that we also have, at least for myself, a responsibility to take a look and if people feel blocked,
absolutely.
and if, that I also have a responsibility to spend years and years looking for where I was wounded and how I felt.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes.
I'm writing a memoir about my own traumas, and I come to stops where I just can't do any more on it. And in accepted a task to ghostwrite a life story for a woman who's got a horrible life. And I find her material troubling for me. And so friends have questioned the wisdom of me working on that.
Right.
So I'm working with a partner, and I've thought about ways to give myself a little distance from it in how we divide up our responsibilities.
Right.
But I guess the questions I wanted to ask are how to sort of protect myself from getting overwhelmed, and also how to resolve this other woman's book when she's not healed. She's clearly still really traumatized.
Right.
So there's not gonna be like her answer to why this happened to me, or
Right. And you're financially committed to this project?
No, she hasn't offered to pay us. I mean, it's just a
I mean, I don't know you, but I'm going to get protective on your behalf. No, that's not allowed. Spiritually, professionally, and you're giving so much of your emotional labor, your intellectual expertise, and no.
keep talking about, okay, we just want our names on the cover.
Your book is the one your story, your book deserves your name. Nobody gets your name. Actually,
she has to do her own dirty work.
Yeah.
No, but you're worth something. Your work is worth something.
We have to pull a Tina Turner. Your name. It's your name. Pull a Tina Turner. No. If there's you're not getting paid for it, and you're also being emotionally, no. Yeah. One last question, and then thank you guys. Yes.
Okay, you talked about, as part of your healing, sitting with the inner child.
Yeah.
And giving her unconditional love. And I'm struggling with that as I write my traumatic memoir.
I know.
So do you have any tips on specific things so that I can unconditionally love my inner child?
You know what was, because at first, like when I tried that, I was like, what the what kind of new age bullshit is this? Right? My trick was first, I couldn't even love my inner child. I had to first, do you have any siblings that you like? Right? I have a younger sister who most of the time I like. I love her all the time. She's 11 years younger. She was my first, the inner child, or the child. Because I would say, okay, I feel like starving myself, but would I ever allow this to happen to her? No. You know? Yeah. Find a child in your life who you do authentically, fiercely love and protect. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.